Hello, so we are presenting the China Belt and Roadway Initiative for this project. The home country is China and the host country is Vietnam. So the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, more commonly referred to as BRI, was launched in 2013 by Chinese President Xi Jinping. It is the world's most ambitious infrastructure plan as of yet, and it consists of a collection of development and investment initiatives stretching across East Asia to Europe. Besides just the physical infrastructure, it also plans to expand the international use of the Chinese currency, renminbi. The campaign timetable, which did launch in 2013, is to consist of a multi-decade campaign that will spread over many different countries and cultures, and as of yet, the Chinese government has not placed a deadline date on this campaign. So far, over 70 countries have joined or expressed interest in joining BRI. This accounts for about 2/3 of the world's population. And if we look over here to this this image on the right, you will see what the Chinese government expects the end of BRI to look like with these land and sea corridors. As the BRI is a very large campaign, there are a lot of stakeholders, a lot of financial investors, a plethora of finances being funneled into this campaign. If you look at the bottom of this page, you'll see the World Bank has pledged about 80 billion US dollars towards the BRI so far. And between this page and the next page, we have compiled a list of businesses and corporations that have been putting money towards the BRI. The program is expected to involve beyond $1 trillion in infrastructure development for ports, roads, railways, airports, and telecommunication networks by the end of the campaign. BRI's mission is to construct a unified large market and make full use of both international and domestic markets through cultural exchange and integration. Its vision is a vast network of interrelated railroads, pipelines, highways, and streamlined border crossings. And its values are to enhance regional connectivity and mutual understanding and trust of member nations. A bit more about BRI. It will connect Asia, Africa, and Europe via those 6 corridors, and the aim is to improve regional integration, increase trade, and stimulate economic growth within those partnered nations. The inspiration did come from the Silk Road established during the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago, and it is referred to also as One Belt, One Road. BRI is comprised of 2 different segments: the Silk Road Economic Belt, which refers to the land corridors connecting China and Southeast Asia, South Asia, West Asia, the Middle East, as well as Europe, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, which is the sea route linking Asia, Africa, and Europe. Some of China's objectives for BRI include policy coordination, which is signed cooperation agreements between the countries; facilities connectivity, which promotes the physical connectivity across these continents; unimpeded trade, which will facilitate the global trade between these partnered countries; the financial connectivity, which will promote new financial mechanisms such as the Silk Road Fund and the New Development Bank; and people-to-people bonds, which will help create that sense of society between all of these partnered countries through strengthening science, education, and health information spread across the borders. A major challenge presented by BRI is the criticism that China is looking to monopolize trade through BRI. Some have also called it a geopolitical move by China that might have more of a capitalistic and even imperialistic tendency than the initiative lets on to its partnered nations. There is also a worry that it might stunt the growth of some of the developing nations that are more likely to join the BRI than some of the more developed nations. BRI does serve as an opportunity for Vietnam and vice versa because Vietnam has a major infrastructure issue within its country. Only 20% of its roads are paved, and the country is already looking for outside investment to help build and grow the nation. So looking at the SWOT analysis, some of the strengths of BRI include the untapped natural resources that can be found in Vietnam. Vietnam has 1,600 to 2,700 hours of sunlight per year with an average wind speed of 7 to 11 meters per second. This will give enormous potential for wind and solar power generation for BRI if they do partner with Vietnam. Also, Vietnam's location is considered to be one of the most dynamic markets in the world, and essentially it serves as an entrance to the Southeast Asian market for BRI. Additionally, there is a young workforce and cheaper labor costs that can be found here. 54.5 million people are in the nation's workforce, and about 74% of Vietnam's workforce is under 50 years old. Some weaknesses of BRI: since its launch in 2013, it has been very slow to start any of the processes involved in building infrastructure in a lot of these countries, so not a lot of work has been progressed as of yet for the campaign. There is also no support from the US or India. There is a fear of what is called the Chinese debt trap, which is Chinese loans given to struggling countries like Indonesia that become indebted to China and incur a debt for equity swap. There is also a lack of Chinese campaign attention to the smaller local businesses, civil society organizations, and local communities. And overall, that could lead to a poor public perception of China in a lot of these partner countries. Some opportunities for BRI include economic growth, new trade and investment opportunities, new and improved export markets, more political influence for China, strengthened partnerships with different countries, some military expansion. There's a lot of opportunity that can be seen from this ambitious program. In terms of threats, there were actually several anti-Chinese protests in Vietnam in 2018 over the South China Sea disputes, in which over 100 Vietnamese protesters were arrested. So there is a poor public perception of Chinese influence in Vietnam, both over those disputes and over some failed past Chinese projects in Vietnam, as well as the Chinese debt fear that we talked about earlier. Vietnamese scholars have warned of the potential for an excessive dependence on China from the initiative. And at the same time, Vietnam does have other infrastructure options they could look towards, such as public-private partnership and ODA loans or official development assistance loans from Japan. So doing a deeper dive into the background of Vietnam, we're going to start with this graph here. According to the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Vietnam has a huge demand for infrastructure investments. Vietnam is struggling to meet this demand because of a decreased inflow of official development assistance. In 2009, difficulties grew in promoting public-private partnership projects because of a tightening financial and legal regulations, as well as limited state funding investment due to budgetary constraints. There is an estimated $605 billion that needs to be put into Vietnam's infrastructure between 2016 and 2040 to get it towards where it wants to be. Vietnam is a socialist state. It is the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, but the sole source of leadership, much like China, is a communist party. So both countries are socialist states run by communist parties, and both of their branches of government actually serve as basically rubber stamp governments, while the communist parties of each socialist state are really the ones running the country behind the scenes. In fact, the Vietnamese Communist Party leads the Vietnam Fatherland Front, which is a coalition of numerous popular political and social associations that disseminates party policies, serves as a training ground for potential party members, and submits lists of candidates for seats in the National Assembly. Taking a look at the Vietnamese economy, Vietnam has a socialist-oriented market economy. It is among the 10 fastest growing economies in Asia this year. Foreign tourism has increased annually since 2005. Education is on the rise in the last decade, and the total GDP has reached $436 billion. Because of the Communist Party, there is strict guidelines that the media has to follow within Vietnam. There are harsh penalties for independent bloggers and citizen writers, such as long-term jail time or even potential banishment if they write the wrong things. Looking at particular forms of medium, TV is the main medium in Vietnam. Vietnam television is run by the Communist Party. They do host all of the national networks, and a large amount of censorship does take place for all media in Vietnam. Any material deemed to threaten communist rule, including political dissent, will be blocked by the Communist Party. Game shows are actually one of the most popular forms of entertainment in Vietnam. This is partly due to the fact that the communist government has been very flexible with game shows because they don't have any political content. In fact, private entrepreneurs have been allowed to produce the programs, and networks are buying licensing rights and importing games from US, Japan, Europe. This is something that you don't really see in Vietnam besides in this particular medium of game shows because of how strict the Communist Party normally is. In terms of internet penetration, a recent study from 2017 does show that only 46% of the Vietnam population utilizes social media. About 68.5 million people were internet users in 2018, and YouTube and Facebook lead the race for social media in Vietnam. Moving back to this slide real quick, based on social media, in 2019, Force 47 was activated, which requires all citizen data and communication to be stored on Vietnamese servers and forfeited at any time. So this does just go to showcase how strong of a hand the government has over all forms of media within the country. Taking a look at the Corruption Perception Index from 2018, which uses a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is highly corrupt and 100 is very clean, you can see that both countries have been on the decrease since the year prior. They both score very low and are viewed as highly corrupt from this index. Looking towards the Freedom House Democracy Index, you can also see that both of these countries are viewed as not free. They both have very low scores. This is probably due to the suppressed nature of both cultures and the strong-handed government that you see in these socialist states from the Communist parties controlling them. However, despite this low freedom score, both of them have very, very high literacy rates, which just show the high value on education that is seen within these countries. We can take a look at Hofstede's insights. Both countries are highly collectivist by nature. This can lead to a cold or hostile outlook on outgroups. So this does factor in a lot to why there is such a poor public perception of foreign investors in Vietnam by the Vietnamese citizens. China does rank much higher in masculinity, meaning the culture is very success-oriented, whereas Vietnam is driven more by the quality of life. Both cultures are adaptable to change as seen in their level of uncertainty avoidance. And as a more normative society, Vietnamese culture values time-honored traditions and views societal change with suspicion. So BRI should focus on Vietnamese males and females aged 25 to 54 as their primary audience. This does make up about 45.67% of the Vietnamese population. There should be an even more primary focus on those who would benefit most from the increased infrastructure, such as the urban dwellers, commuters, and the owners of those small businesses. In terms of secondary audience, there should be a focus towards tourists, as that has been on the rise in Vietnam for the past couple of years, and take a strong look at media as well, because due to the lack of information put out by the Communist Party in China about BRI, there has been a lot of information presented from other sources, such as BBC, the New York Times, about the campaign and what it really means and what it really stands for. So BRI does need to focus on how the media is viewing them and the public perception that comes from that. Taking a quick look at some of the audience demographics in Vietnam, there's a total population of over about 97 million. The urban dwellers are about 36.6% of the total population, and that rate of urbanization, as mentioned previously, is on the rise annually. Some audience psychographics, the Vietnamese consumers are highly ethnocentric. This does tie in a lot to the collectivist society that you do see in Vietnam. As we mentioned, tourism is on the rise. There were 80 million domestic travelers in 2018. All of these statistics go to prove how dire it is for Vietnam to improve their infrastructure so that tourism can continue to rise, domestic traveling can continue to rise, all of that good stuff. And lastly, what should BRI do to specifically target that audience, the Vietnamese males and females 25 to 54? First, they really need to try to smooth some of those relations with the Vietnamese government, kind of increase that public perception that you see from the Vietnamese citizens, because at the moment, not much is going to be done with BRI between these two countries if they can't work something out there. Soothe some of that rising anti-globalization and trade protectionism fears with specific Chinese reform achievements. And maybe start off with a smaller joint project before jumping headfirst with a long-term loan from BRI, because that will prove that China has the quality to put towards the infrastructure and is really looking for the best interest of Vietnam, as well as getting that monetary value from that loan. So taking a deeper dive at the circuit of culture that we've learned about thus far in the semester, starting with regulation, you really do see some of those Chinese-sponsored developments such as community centers and malls in Vietnam. For production, we really focus on that friendship palace between Vietnam and China that does showcase both of their cultures and helps facilitate that governmental exchange between the two countries and their both sets of cultures. For representation, you see the murals, the buildings, the flags, that open border between China and Vietnam where goods can be sold very easily between the two borders. For consumption, there is the interaction and exchanging of goods and services between both audiences and both of those countries. And then, of course, for identity, the governments can be somewhat cordial towards each other, but as only 10% of Vietnamese people do approve of Chinese influence in Vietnam, it is something that BRI does need to focus on and try to improve if they do want to have a long-term placement in Vietnam and help build their infrastructure. So moving on, as mentioned previously, BRI and the Chinese government does not put out a lot of traditional like social media, public relations, press releases, anything of that sort. Really, when they're putting out information on BRI, it is more through things of this nature, this video you're about to see with Chinese government officials discussing what is going on with BRI, and also through the annual forums, which we'll discuss a little bit more on the next slide. So as you can see from that video, what the Chinese officials do have to say about BRI is very important form of media presented about BRI to outside sources. It is some of the only information we actually get on BRI from the Chinese government. So it is something that is one of the main forms of consumption of BRI actions that you can see, and the channels of communication that they give people to learn more about BRI from the actual source. So the theme and key messages that the Chinese government does put out is a lot of what you heard the Chinese official discussing in that video, which is really trying to make these countries aware of how much taking out a loan with them and letting BRI come in and help their infrastructure can boost their trade, boost their economy, and really just overall help their country. Some of the particular actions you see taking place are the annual BRI forums held in Beijing. The last one was in April 2019, and the next one is currently to be held sometime in April of 2020. Among the channels that you can see besides that video I just showed, and many other videos, such as Chinese President Xi Jinping does do a lot of talks on BRI specifically. You can also go to the Chinese website, and they have a lot of particular information on BRI. Now looking at the specific evaluations of the previously mentioned objectives, in terms of the output, for policy coordination, you can see that Vietnam did endorse the BRI and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. China did develop that $25 million Friendship Palace in Vietnam for the physical aspect. In terms of trade, there is an ongoing trade war between U.S. and China. Financial connectivity, you do see the infrastructure investments towards Vietnam's roads, rail, airports, telecommunications, and that sort. And then for that people-to-people bond, we do go back and look at that Friendship Palace in Vietnam, as it does show a little bit of the tensions relaxing between Vietnamese and Chinese culture. As for impact objectives, no new infrastructure plans have actually resulted from BRI in Vietnam. Hopefully within the 2020 forum for the BRI, there might be some new discussions on that, but at the moment for policy coordinations and facilities connectivity, there haven't been any actual moves with BRI and Vietnam towards infrastructure discussions. For unimpeded trade, Vietnam does enjoy a boost in exports and services in the wake of the U.S.-China relations, but a con to that is that Vietnam is at a risk of trade protection and inflation because of that. For financial connectivity, it is still in progress. Vietnam does need about $605 billion still by 2040 to reach their goal for their infrastructure in that country. So they have a long way to go there. And for people-to-people bonds, even after the Friendship Palace is created, there is still a deep-seated distrust between China and Vietnam. So a quick summary. There remain several challenges and unknowns that need to be sorted out before the BRI can come to life in Vietnam. Although Vietnam has officially endorsed the BRI, Vietnam remains distrusting of China, which is preventing any solid plans for infrastructure change. Recently, Vietnam went from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the fastest growing countries in East Asia, with improvement in economics, demographics, and education. In order to continue its growth and meet its infrastructure goal, Vietnam needs to strengthen its relationship with China as much as its funding will come from the BRI. Some key takeaways here: Vietnam's economy and infrastructure are on the uptick. China and Vietnam continue to have a contentious relationship. The BRI is still in the very earliest stages. The BRI has had several countries endorse it, but most are wary of China's intentions at the moment, and countries who oppose the BRI are very strongly against it. Some specific recommendations include China and Vietnam will need to improve their relationship to meet their goals for economic growth, and at the current rate of growth, Vietnam needs to start investing in waste management, pollution control, and other ways of reducing its environmental footprint. The next couple of slides are just the works cited pages that we have from the research we put into this project.